I was born into a house that smiled for pictures but screamed in private. A house of porcelain frames, curated dinners, and expectations sharper than glass. My mother used to say, "We don't raise girls to cry, we raise them to shine." But I wasn't shining. I was surviving. I learned early how to tiptoe through silence so loud it felt like thunder, and how to disappear while still being in the room. They all looked at me so, but never really saw me. I was the wallpaper in my own life, blending into corners, absorbing every insult, every comparison, every sigh of disappointment. I remember my 8th birthday, not because of cake, but because they forgot it. Completely. No one remembered, not even my mother. I sat on the kitchen floor while they laughed in the living room, watching reruns of a life I didn't belong to. That was the first time I realized I didn't live in a home. I lived in a performance. My siblings were the stars. I was the understudy for a role no one ever planned to cast. My father, present in title only. He spoke in corrections, not conversations. I stopped expecting affection the day he said, "You'll never be like your sister, so stop trying." I raised myself between those walls, taught myself how to braid my hair, how to fake a smile, how to read emotions like a second language. I became fluent in their disappointment, fluent in invisibility. I became the girl who carried straight A's like armor, hoping maybe, just maybe, they'd see my worth written in grades. But even when I got into the top math league, all I heard was, "Your cousin got into Harvard. That's real achievement." I was a shadow chasing a spotlight that never turned my way. But I kept going. Not out of hope, out of spite. I told myself one thing every night. They don't get to decide who I become, even when it felt like I didn't exist. I was building something, quietly, brick by brick. Behind every slammed door, I grew thicker skin. Behind every silent dinner, I sharpened my mind. Behind every insult, I wrote a new page of the woman I would one day become. A woman they would regret overlooking because one day they'll need me. And I'll remember how little I ever meant to them and how much I had to become to matter to myself. In school, I sat in the back row, not because I didn't know the answers, but because I didn't want anyone to see how hard I was trying. Trying felt like begging, and I had already spent my whole life begging for attention at home. I didn't want to do it here too, but I watched everything. I noticed how teachers' eyes sparkled when certain kids walked in, how the world opened for the loud ones, the pretty ones, the kids whose parents showed up for conferences and clapped at recitals. My seat was always empty, no claps, no eyes, just silence. Again, but I learned how to use that silence like a weapon. I turned it into focus. While other kids played, I stayed late in the library, reading about women who built empires out of nothing, women who were laughed at, dismissed, underestimated. I memorized every one of their names. They became my secret army. I told myself, they didn't wait to be chosen. They chose themselves. So I did too. I applied to every scholarship I could find, every mentorship, every opportunity, alone. I forged my own path the way orphans do, and with grit instead of guidance. The first time I saw my name printed on a certificate, I stared at it for 10 minutes, not because I was proud, but because I wasn't sure it was real. Me, the girl they forgot in car rides and family dinners, the girl who sat through birthdays with no candles. I held that paper in my hands like it was proof I existed, that my life, my effort, my pain. It all counted, even if no one at home ever said it out loud. But the truth, the loneliness was suffocating. You can only clap for yourself so many times before the echo turns into a cry. And even though I was getting stronger, I started to feel something crack beneath the surface. A part of me still wanted them to notice, to say, "We were wrong," to finally look at me with the eyes they gave to everyone else. I hated that I wanted that, but I did. And that's the thing about being raised in a house that never saw your worth. You start to question if you ever had any at all. I didn't cry. I wrote every night in a notebook I kept hidden in my closet. I wrote down every insult, every moment of being ignored, every achievement they shrugged off. It wasn't a diary, it was evidence. Someday I'd use it. I didn't know how yet. But I was collecting it, storing it, planning, because I knew this wasn't the end of my story. It was only the setup. There comes a moment when something in you snaps, not loudly, not violently, but like a rope that finally gives out after years of quiet tension. For me, that moment came during my senior year of high school, when I was chosen to give the graduation speech. I remember holding the letter in my hands, heart racing, eyes watering. I ran to tell my mother, thinking maybe this would be the moment she'd finally look proud. She barely looked up from her phone. "That's nice," she said, without even asking what the speech was about. That's when I stopped hoping, stopped trying to earn something that should have never needed proof. I gave that speech in front of hundreds. I talked about resilience, about unseen battles, about becoming your own guide when no one shows you the map. I saw teachers cry, strangers applauded, and yet there was an empty seat in the front row, reserved for someone who never intended to come. I smiled anyway. But inside, I buried the last shred of hope I had for them. I wasn't theirs anymore. I was mine. College was my escape plan. I got in on a full ride, not that anyone at home asked how. I packed my things in silence, same way I had lived. No one offered help. No one asked where I was going. I left a note on the fridge. "Thanks for raising me, even if you didn't mean to. It was petty. It was real. It was the first time I said something without waiting for approval." When I arrived on campus, something strange happened. People saw me. My professors looked me in the eye. My roommate listened when I spoke. I felt the unfamiliar ache of being acknowledged, and it hurt because it reminded me of everything I never got. But I also felt something else. Possibility. Maybe I wasn't broken. Maybe I was just blooming in bad soil. Maybe all I needed was distance from the people who convinced me I was too small. And if this part of my story resonates with you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. That's how YouTube knows this matters, and how more people can find it. Because someone out there needs to hear this, just like I once did. College was more than freedom. It was rebirth. I reinvented myself without even meaning to. I started dressing how I wanted, not how they taught me to blend in. I spoke up in class. I challenged professors. I submitted essays that dripped with the pain of someone who had lived, not just learned, and people noticed. For the first time, I was more than the quiet girl. I was bold, direct, unapologetic, and it terrified me because every step into this new version of myself felt like betrayal, not to them, to the girl I used to be, the one who waited, the one who begged. I landed an internship my sophomore year, competitive, cutthroat, the kind of thing my father would have bragged about if it were my brother. But he never called, never asked. Still, I printed the acceptance letter and folded it into that same notebook where I kept my evidence, my proof, my fuel. While other interns were just building resumes, I was building purpose. I came in early, stayed late, delivered more than they asked. And behind every email I sent, every project I crushed, was the ghost of that girl sitting alone on her birthday, reminding me why I couldn't stop. Then it happened. I was asked to give a talk, not at school, but at a conference. A real one, big names, bigger egos, and I spoke the way I always had, from the gut, from the wound. I didn't polish it, I made it bleed, and people stood up. People cried, and someone whispered to me afterward, "You should write a book." I smiled, but didn't say it out loud. I already have one. It just doesn't have a cover yet. That night, I stared at myself in the mirror, really looked. And I didn't see the wallpaper girl anymore. I saw a woman built from scraps, from silence, from things never said. A woman who had nothing given to her and made everything out of it. They still hadn't called, not once, but it didn't matter because I was becoming someone they could no longer ignore. It came in a white envelope with gold lettering. No return address, just my name, spelled correctly for once, which meant they really wanted me to see it. Inside, an invitation to my grandfather's funeral, the man who once said I was too serious to be lovable. I hadn't seen him in years, and yet something about that card made my hands tremble, not because of grief, because of opportunity. I hadn't stepped foot in that house since I left for college. The thought of returning felt like swallowing glass. But then I remembered something my mentor told me. Sometimes the best revenge is simply showing up, different. So I circled the date, booked a flight, and started planning my entrance like a general studies a battlefield. I wasn't going back to mourn, I was going back to witness, to stand in the very place I was erased from, and let them see what they'd lost. I wore navy blue, simple, sharp. I arrived exactly 15 minutes late. Intentional. When I walked through the church doors, heads turned. Not because of my outfit, but because I walked like I belonged. In my body, in my skin, in this world. I saw their eyes scanning me, searching for the girl they once dismissed. But she was gone. What stood before them was someone they didn't have the language to understand anymore. And I loved that. My mother didn't speak. My siblings avoided eye contact, but I sat in the front row, boldly, silently. I watched them squirm with the discomfort of my presence, and when the priest opened the floor for reflections, I stood, not to talk about him, but about legacy, about how some people build homes and others just build walls. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. Truth, when spoken right, doesn't require pointing fingers. It echoes. And afterward, someone from the family, a distant aunt, came up to me and said, "You've changed." I looked her straight in the eye and replied, "No, I've revealed." That was the first time I saw fear in their eyes. Not fear of me, fear of the truth, because now I was louder in my silence than they ever were in their cruelty. 3 days after the funeral, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize, but somehow knew. I let it buzz 5 times before answering. It was my mother. Her voice, stiff, rehearsed, said, "We were thinking maybe you could come by for dinner." There was no apology, no warmth, just a calculated invitation, like I was a networking contact, not her daughter. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it took my presence at a funeral to remind them I existed. I said, "I'd think about it." Then I hung up. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilt, just clarity. I didn't owe them a performance. I didn't owe them anything. But still, curiosity whispered louder than pride. I went. The house hadn't changed. Same curtains, same scent of cold perfection, same tension. My brother was there, polished as ever, making small talk about real estate. My sister smiled too wide, complimenting my dress like we were at brunch. And my mother, she didn't even ask how I'd been. She asked what I did now, like my title mattered more than my healing. I answered calmly, "I speak, I write, I help people rebuild what others tried to destroy." Her face froze. We ate in silence, broken only by awkward questions and shallow comments. But I was calm. I wasn't the one seeking approval anymore. I was the mirror now. And they didn't like what they saw in their reflection. My presence was a reminder of everything they tried to suppress, everything they pretended never happened. After dessert, my mother pulled me aside. Her voice shook just slightly. "We miss you. We want things better." I looked at her, truly looked, and I saw a woman who didn't understand how to love what she never tried to know. I nodded gently. "Then you'll need to meet the real me, and she doesn't shrink." And I walked out, not angry, not broken, just free. After that dinner, I didn't look back. I poured all of it, the years of silence, the erasure, the slow rebuilding, into my writing. I posted one story, just one, titled it, "The Girl They Never Noticed." It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, raw, unfiltered. Within days, it spread. Thousands of comments, people saying, "This is me." I thought I was alone. You put my childhood into words. And for the first time, I realized something huge. My pain had a purpose. It wasn't just mine. It was ours, and every word I wrote was a torch in someone else's darkness. Publishers started reaching out, interviews followed. One podcast host cried during our recording. Another asked, "Did they ever apologize?" I said, "No, and that's okay." Because healing isn't waiting for an apology. It's choosing to live like you never needed one. That line went viral. And suddenly, the girl they forgot became the voice people couldn't ignore. But then came the letter, handwritten, from my father. He said he read my piece, that he didn't realize how much damage was done, that he thought I was just quiet, not crushed, not broken, not invisible. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just said, "I'm sorry you grew up thinking you weren't enough." I stared at that sentence for a long time, not because it healed anything, but because it proved something. They finally saw me, and that changed everything. Not because I needed their recognition, but because I no longer did. Success has a strange way of rewriting history. Not the truth, but the version people choose to remember. Suddenly, distant relatives started posting my articles like they'd supported me all along. Old classmates reached out, saying, "We always knew you'd do something big." And worst of all, my mother began telling people that she raised a writer, as if silence raised me, as if neglect was nurturing. I watched as the people who once dismissed me now tried to fold themselves into my narrative, as if they'd always believed. It infuriated me, but I didn't fight them. I didn't post angry rants or expose their hypocrisy. That's not how you win against the past. I just kept telling the truth. On stage, on paper, in interviews, I shared the reality, not to shame them, but to free people who still lived in houses like mine, who still questioned their worth because someone else never saw it. And every time I shed another layer of the girl who once begged to be chosen. But one day, my sister reached out, not for show, for real. She sent a voice note, trembling, hesitant. I read everything you've written, and I'm sorry. I saw how they treated you. I just didn't want it to be me. I was afraid, but you were always the strong one, even when we made you feel weak. That broke me. Not in pain, in release, because someone else finally named it, the truth, the cost, the silence, and I didn't need to punish her. I just needed her to say it, and she did, in her own voice, in her own time. Not all justice wears armor. Sometimes it comes gently, in an apology you never expected, from someone who once looked the other way. There's a difference between returning to a place out of need and returning by choice. Years had passed. I was invited to speak at a local university, just 10 minutes from the house I grew up in. The organizers didn't know the irony, but I did. The auditorium sat 500, sold out, my face on posters around the city, and the topic, rising from silence. The title alone made my chest tighten, not from fear, from closure. I stood backstage watching the seats fill, and then I saw her, my mother, in the third row, not the front, not the back, right in the center, where you can't hide. She came alone. I hadn't spoken to her in a year. She didn't wave, just sat, perfectly still, and suddenly I wasn't nervous. I was ready, because this time I wasn't the girl craving her attention. I was the woman delivering a message bigger than either of us. I walked on stage, the lights hit, and I spoke like the storm I had become. I told my story, not with blame, but with fire. I spoke of what it means to grow up unseen, of the danger in quiet cruelty, of how we learn to mother ourselves when no one else does. I looked out at the audience and said, some of us weren't given love. We became it. And in that moment, something shifted. I wasn't just healing myself anymore. I was handing others the match. When it ended, the applause was thunderous. Strangers stood, strangers wept. And my mother, she stayed seated, hands clasped, eyes glassy. She didn't approach me, didn't say a word. But as I walked past, she looked at me, really looked. And for once, I didn't feel small under her gaze. They say revenge is best served cold. But I learned something deeper. Real revenge isn't ice. It's growth. It's becoming everything they said you couldn't, without needing them to see it. Still, part of me wondered if that chapter would ever truly close. Until the day my book hit the shelves. It was titled Invisible Until I Wasn't. A memoir, a reckoning, a resurrection. It sold out in the first week, and then I got an email from a girl, young, scared. Her message read, "Your story is mine." I thought I was broken, but now I see I'm just beginning. I read it 3 times, and I cried. Not because it hurt, but because I had finally become the person I needed when I was her age. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was changing lives. And then, out of nowhere, my mother sent one last message. No long explanation, no fake sweetness, just 3 lines. I read the book. I didn't recognize myself. But I believe you. That was it. And strangely, it was enough, because I never wanted revenge that hurt. I wanted truth that healed. And in the end, I didn't win the way they thought I would, by getting rich or famous or throwing everything back in their faces. I won by no longer needing to. I didn't win. I became